Hello, welcome to Claigan's webinar on updates in minerals due diligence for 2024. We like to give regular updates on the changes and what's new, what people need to be paying attention to. And so here is our current one for 2024. My name is Tim Holt. I'm the operations manager at Claigan. I have been involved with conflict minerals for well over a decade, and I'm joined by
Lucy Warren. I've been with Clegan for around 7 years now, and I'm the subject matter expert here for minerals due diligence.
Excellent. So as you see, we'll both be talking to you today. We'll kind of be switching a bit back and forth. A few things right off the top before we get into the subject at hand. Every registrant will receive a copy of these slides. So hopefully we'll have an email going up sort of tomorrow morning. You'll have a PDF of the slides. Additionally, we will put a recording of this presentation up onto YouTube. You'll be able to see it there. As well, if there is time, when we get to the end of the presentation, at the end of the webinar, we will be able to take some questions. If we do run out of time and you still have a question we're not able to get to, by all means, please reach out to us. We thoroughly enjoy getting to engage with people, getting to hear what people are thinking about, their questions, their concerns, areas where they're looking to explore or open up in their research. So we always enjoy talking with people in the field. If you have any questions, please send us an email, and our email addresses will be available on the very last slide. Okay, let me get underway. I will first go in an overview of the agenda today. First, I'm going to do a quick about us. Really, this is just so that you get a good understanding of our experience. We want you to know that we're coming from a place with some genuine credibility here. And we will highlight some of our involvement with the evolving conflict minerals landscape over the past decade or more now. Then we'll move ahead into looking at some of the current research. And what we're doing here, we've been doing this for a long time now. We really have. And yet we still have people that come up to us every year and they don't know that we've already have answers to them, a solution for them in place, and backed up by data to problems that they have that they've been trying to solve. And they don't always know that these solutions are out there, that this level of detail is out there. And they're surprised with when they see the work we do. They can sometimes be surprised with the level of detail in our research, and we want to make sure people understand just what we have here. They're surprised by the wide variety of resources we consult, and the truth of it is, what we do, this is more than just a full-time job. So we condense all this information, all this research into a package so that people can be properly informed. So we'll kind of go over that. And then I will explain a variety of the minerals that we investigate and also the risk categories. Those are important too. It's not just the minerals, but what specific issues, what risks do we look at? And the truth of it is, things have expanded greatly since the early days of the initial conflict minerals reporting, when sourcing from covered countries was the primary concern. So it's important to understand all these things that are on the table and all the ways that we can help, and we can help inform and educate. Then we'll move ahead and we'll look at our Dodd-Frank process. Now, a lot of you may have a good understanding of your 3TG, tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold conflict minerals. Your program there. So why are we going over this now? Well, what we want to do is we want to go over this process. This is how we do it, because ultimately this was the starting point for complying with Dodd-Frank, yes, but we've really expanded. We've taken the process behind it and really expanded out so that we can look at new metals, new risks, new problems, and provide new information and better inform our clients. So we kind of want to go over that. So it's the starting place for all of our research. And so it's important to understand this core approach so you can see how it builds out from there. And it's also too important to understand that, I say we have evolved this process to address the needs of this growing conflict minerals landscape. And then once we kind of go through the process itself, Lucy's going to take you through, give you some concrete examples of some high-risk gold refiners. These are names that you may have heard: African Gold Refinery, Augmont Enterprises. You may hear these names. They may be coming from your customers, may be inquiring about them, or perhaps you pushed on some of your suppliers. But you may have heard these names. We want you to understand why your customers may be pushing on these names. So we'll kind of get into the details there. Lots of good information there. Then we're going to switch gears and we're going to look a little bit an update on 3T. So instead of looking at gold like we have with those two case studies, we're going to give just a brief update on the changes in 3Ts sourced from the covered countries. The last year, there's been a lot of changes. We just want to brief you on those. Then we're going to move away from your typical Dodd-Frank discussions and then look at forced labor. Now, this is something we've touched upon in a few different webinars. This is a topic that's been getting more attention lately, especially due to the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. So what we want to do is provide an overview of the number of smelters sourcing from the region, from Xinjiang, the province of Xinjiang, and as well as those that are, there's even more that are affiliated with the region, although they may not be sourcing directly. So we want to go over those. And in previous webinars, we have laid out the evidence for the smelter sourcing from Xinjiang, and we have a new one that we want to go over, and we want to provide that evidence so that other people can follow up with it as well. So we will lay those details out. Then we're going to switch gear again and say it's a big topic. There's lots to cover in the mineral supply chain in 2024. So we're going to switch gears again. We're going to look at the PRT. This is the pilot reporting template. Some of you may be familiar with it. Some of you may not have heard of it yet, but we want to make sure you're aware of it. And what we're really going to do is provide some recommendations on some things that you can do, hopefully to provide some early successes and really build a foundation that you can grow from and you can expand from there. So we'll give you some recommendations for what you should be doing now and how you should be thinking about it moving forward. And then finally, we'll look at some broader ESG research. And really what I think what you're going to see here is, as industry has dug into some issues, like say Dodd-Frank, we uncover related issues that are just as important. They may not be applicable to Dodd-Frank, but they may be applicable to other laws or other concerns, other corporate social responsibility concerns, things that companies are going to want to know about and be able to pay attention to. And in a lot of these issues, there's a wide variety of risks. You'll see when Lucy gets into it, a lot of different risk types, and there's an interconnectedness to these risks. So we really want to make sure people are informed of these issues and can use that as an understanding. And to demonstrate that, Lucy will take us through a case study on the Amazon region. Okay, so Claigan's experience. So we've been doing this for a long time, and ultimately we've been at the forefront of identifying these risks. And the reason why we like doing this is because we enjoy working with our clients. We want to get this information out to industry at large so that collectively we can address these problems. This is not something that one company can solve by themselves. So as an example, Claigan was there. We testified to US Congress when Dodd-Frank 1502 was under consultation. So we were working on this before the law was in place. And the same is true with the SEC final rule. Claigan's mentioned 18 times in the final rule. And then beyond that, once Dodd-Frank was in place, we were the first company to be providing information on gold refiners sourcing from the covered countries. Now, this may not seem like a big deal now, but I assure you the common opinion back in 2013 is that, and I heard this all the time, well, nobody knows which gold refiners are sourcing from the covered countries. And I have to tell people, well, no, that's simply not true. We know because we've done the research, we've done the digging, we know for a fact which ones are, and the truth of it was, don't take my word for it. Here's the evidence. We like to also show the evidence to it. It's not just about don't trust me just because I said it. Trust me because I'm showing you the evidence behind it as well. I think that's a really important piece of it. It's to also give you more confidence that you can trust what we're saying and that these are legitimate claims you should be looking into. I gave a webinar a couple of years ago, right at the outset of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I noted then that as unfortunate as was going to be, that this invasion was going to have serious effects on the mineral supply chain, and that turned out to be absolutely true. Companies may not have wanted to believe it at that time that it was going to go that way, but today there are no RMAP conformant Russian smelters. Right, so this has absolutely had a huge impact there. And then also Claigan was also the first to get our name out there to provide information on smelters that are sourcing from Xinjiang. Lucy was at the forefront of that research, digging into it, doing the work, uncovering which smelters are connected to Xinjiang, because that has become such an important thing for companies to look into. So as I say, we have a strong, proven track record of being there, of looking ahead, and of having an understanding of the risks that are involved for all kinds of smelter issues. Okay, and then mineral scopes. So let's talk about, so that's our experience, but let's talk about some mineral scopes. What do we do? What are the types of topics we look into? So this is really about our experience with working with these minerals. And so yes, we've done work with the CMRT, gold, tin, tantalum, and tungsten. We've got well over a decade of experience working with these smelters and looking at the due diligence. And Lucy will go into it in a moment, the types of information that we look at for due diligence, because it's not just about Dodd-Frank anymore. There's a whole wide variety of issues. But because companies have such a strong understanding of their 3TG supply chain, they want to know about this information, and they want to know ahead of time so that they're not caught unaware of risks that are out there. And that's why they come to us, so that they have the knowledge ahead of time and they can plan for it, and they can make sure that they're in a good position and that their company's not going to get caught unaware. So yes, we do this with the tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold. And by the way, if companies ever need help with reaching out to their supply chain to collect CMRTs, we do that as well. We do that for all three of these: the CMRT, the EMRT, and the PRT. We can help with that, but it's also, so we do that. We also have the due diligence that goes behind it. Same is true here with what's the minerals on the EMRT, the cobalt and mica. We've been doing this for several years now. We have this, again, this solid, credible, evidence-based due diligence for cobalt and mica processors. And then we're now moving into some of those in the PRT. And I'll talk more about the PRT later in the webinar. But looking at some minerals in particular, we've been looking at some of the battery minerals like lithium, natural graphite, and nickel, but we're also looking at ones like aluminum, copper, and silicon. And so this is something we're doing this work now because we want to be able to prepare our clients for success down the road. It's not something that you can just do, over a weekend. This is not something you're going to do over a month. We know, we've done this before, and we had the experience with the CMRT and EMRT processors, that it takes time to build this up. We need to build relationships with the smelters themselves so they understand why we're reaching out. When we're engaging them and we're wanting to have these conversations with them, they may not understand where we're coming from right away. And so we need to educate them. They may not even want to engage us. So we need to educate them, let them understand where we're coming from and the role we're trying to play to help industry make informed choices about their supply chain. And usually when they do understand what we're doing, they're happy to comply because they understand we're playing an important role here. So yes, we need to engage with them early, but there are also many, many sources that we need to consider to help build our risk profiles. And this just all takes time. And this is why we've already started doing this now, so that, if companies are looking to comply with the EU batteries in 2025, we've got the information in place. We've got the infrastructure in place to be able to assist our clients. Now I'm going to pass things over to Lucy.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. So Tim's given an overview here of the different minerals that we look at. And so now I'm just going to touch on sort of what the risk categories that we've historically been applying to all of these minerals. And so obviously when we're looking at 3TGs, the primary risks that we're looking to identify are those that would be considered a high risk under Dodd-Frank. And so at Claigan, we're identifying any non-RMAP conformant smelters that we find to be sourcing, or we have a reason to believe maybe sourcing from the DRC and the adjoining countries, so the covered countries. Any of those we would be flagging as a high risk for Dodd-Frank. However, we don't just stay focused on the covered countries. We also take a look at conflict affected and high risk areas on a global scale. And so we also flag smelters and refiners sourcing from those regions, which are not RMAP conformant. Then obviously over the last few years, with the introduction of UFLPA, we've been flagging smelters that are connected to mineral sources in the Xinjiang region in China. And finally, we have been flagging smelters sourcing from or located in Russia.
Okay, so I said I really want to take a close look at our core Dodd-Frank process, really so that you understand how this process gets expanded to cover all these other risks and regions of the world that Lucy was just describing. So this really, it's the starting point. So what I'm going to do first, I'm going to go over the 3 key requirements as defined by the SEC final rule on conflict minerals. The reason why is so that you can understand where the role that our research and our process fits into your overall program, and then you can see how it could fit into other programs as well. So the first one for Dodd-Frank, the first key requirement, it's the easiest of the 3. This is determine if you are subject to the rule. Do you manufacture or contract to manufacture parts that contain 3 TGs? I'm assuming if you're listening to this webinar, you probably already know the answer, and I'm going to guess the answer is yes, for at least one of those minerals. Okay, once you determine that, we move to the second key requirement. This is the reasonable country of origin inquiry, often referred to as the RCOI. There are 2 phases to the RCOI. There's the supplier RCOI, and that's where you might reach out, or you might have a service provider reach out to all of your suppliers to collect information, to collect the CMRT, which is then your suppliers describing the 3TG facilities in their supply chain. Now, that's only the first part. That's only the first phase of this RCOI. Then you say, well, now we know what smelters are being reported by your suppliers. Now we need to perform the smelter RCOI. And that's where we want to take that list of smelters, that amalgamated list of smelters across your entire supply chain, and determine which of those smelters are sourcing from the covered countries, or, and this is an important caveat here, or those with a reason to believe they may be sourcing from the covered countries. Okay, so we dig into that. And we're gonna start with, for many companies, they might have 350 odd smelters. We're going to distill that list down to about 50 or so smelters that are connected to the covered countries. Either we've confirmed they're sourcing from the covered countries, or those we have a reason to believe may be. And then finally, what we do, and it's especially with that subset list, is then we move to the due diligence phase. Now, here's the thing: due diligence, it kind of means a few different things depending on when you're talking about it in conflict minerals. When the SEC final rule is talking about it in this particular context, it's due diligence on those smelters connected to the covered countries, whether or not they're benefiting or financing armed groups in the covered countries. Okay, so that's why we want to get just that list that are sourcing from the covered countries. And then of that group, are any benefiting or financing armed groups in the covered countries? So as you can see, this is the starting point for our research. We built this to follow the SEC final rule that we're going to get into. But this is the starting point for our research for all the other work that we do. And we've had to adapt it to address this evolving landscape. But we really think it's important to understand this core approach. Okay. So here's the overall flowchart. We'll spend a few minutes kind of walking through, and you can see the different ways that the different scenarios that may fall out depending on what smelter's saying, depending on what their RMAP status is. So when we reach out in particular to our 3TG smelters, we ask them 3 different questions. The first one, quite simply, is do they process only recycled material, 100% recycled material? We also ask them if they source from the covered countries, and we do list all of the 10 covered countries. And then and as a third question, we ask if they source from any of the CARAs. So here, what we're doing, we're going directly to the source, directly to the smelter. They are going to be the most knowledgeable of their own supply chain. So go to the best source for this information, at least as our starting point. You might as well start with the best source. And here's how this plays out. If a smelter says, yes, they do source from the covered countries, and they're RMAP conformant, or then they're on the left-hand side of this flowchart, and if they're RMAP conformant, according to the rules in Dodd-Frank, effectively that is an example of a smelter responsibly sourcing from the covered countries. They've been through that third-party audit. They're publicly recognized as an RMAP conformant smelter. So this is this would be an example, according to Dodd-Frank, of a smelter responsibly sourcing from the region. On the other hand, you see here, if they are not RMAP conformant, but they are sourcing from the covered countries, this is an example of a high-risk smelter. And Lucy already alluded to a high-risk smelter before, and she's going to go into a couple of them in more detail in a few moments. High-risk smelter, a smelter that's sourcing from the covered countries and is not RMAP conformant. And the true, you may see this from time to time. This smelter in this scenario may be RMAP active. It means they've sort of initiated the audit in some capacity with the RMI, but they have not yet completed that audit. Until they successfully complete that audit, they are not RMAP conformant, and then we would consider the risk to still be there. And the reason why we've seen this happen, and we've seen the scenario play out both ways, we have had smelters that are sourcing from the covered countries and they're listed as active, and then they successfully complete that audit and they come out, and on the other side, they are RMAP conformant smelter. Great, we have a new channel of responsible sourcing from the covered countries. On the other hand, we've seen this several times now, a high-risk smelter that Claigan has identified, and they're active, and for whatever reason, they do not appear to have successfully completed that audit. They are no longer on the active list, and they have not been moved to the conformant list. You can read that however you want to, but ultimately they did not end up in this RMAP conformant status, and that has blown up in some companies' faces who have not taken the proper precautions. So if they are active, we do not regard them as conformant. They're not, but we do regard the risk as still being there. And this really, I think, this sort of highlights the power of the RMAP audit, especially when complying with Dodd-Frank. This is so yes, it's important here. Following the rules for Dodd-Frank, it helps sort of clear that risk, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that companies shouldn't be looking at other available sources to fully understand the types of risks that may be associated with a given smelter. As we will go into in this webinar, there are all kinds of risks that are out there facing companies or facing smelters that companies are going to have to engage with and have to know about. Okay, let's look at the other side of this flowchart. What if when we reach out to a smelter, they say to us, no, we do not source from the covered countries? Okay, well, the first thing we're going to do at that point is look to see if they're RMAP conformant, because if they are, we can accept their answer at face value. There's no real reason for them to lie at this point. They are publicly recognized as an RMAP conformant smelter. So again, this RMAP status it's important for Dodd-Frank in particular when following the SEC final rule. It doesn't mean that the smelter may not have other unrelated skeletons in their closet, but in particular for Dodd-Frank, this is an important tool for industry to have in place. Okay, another scenario here. This is if a smelter says to us, no, they don't source from the covered countries, and they are not currently RMAP conformant. It's not going to necessarily be the same high risk that we saw on the other side, but we need to dig deeper. So the first thing we're going to do is ask that smelter to provide reasonable evidence, okay? And as a reminder, the SEC final rule, it's actually clear on this one. It says, they call it an RCOI, it's a reasonable country of origin inquiry, because they say it is information that is reasonably available to a downstream user. They actually say it's not absolute. So companies, it's not an absolute country of origin inquiry. A company is not expected to be all-knowing, but they are expected to look. And they explicitly state that a company cannot be willfully blind or ignore evidence that a smelter may be sourcing from the covered countries. So companies are expected to look. And I along with that, if you are presented with credible evidence about a smelter sourcing from the covered countries, then yeah, absolutely, you need to investigate. But you'll see here, so the smelter, we've asked them, they said they don't source from the covered countries. They provide us with reasonable evidence. And this might be, they're sourcing from South America, or they're only sourcing recycled materials, something like that. Some kind of reasonable evidence to help bridge the gap, of our knowledge about their sourcing practices. At this point, we're still only relying on information the smelter has provided. And that's not good enough. Even for Dodd-Frank, that's not good enough. We need to dig deeper. And this is where, independent of our this conversation with smelters, Claigan will conduct additional research and due diligence. This is we read various NGO and industry sources, publicly available information, again, that's reasonably available to a downstream user, to look to see if there's any contrary evidence, something suggesting actually maybe they do source from the covered countries, maybe they are connected to the covered countries. But at the end of the day, if they provide that reasonable evidence and we do not find that contrary evidence, then we can accept the answer at that time, because ultimately we have no information connecting them to the covered countries, period. So we're not concerned about due diligence on benefiting or financing the armed groups in the covered countries. There's no initial connection to the region, period. And lastly, there's this discussion of reason to believe. So there are times where a smelter either does not respond to us or does not respond to us clearly enough, and in which case we still need to solve the issue for that smelter. And there we look for a reason to believe they may be sourcing from the covered countries. And there what we're doing is looking at the same types of the same sources as I talked about for contrary evidence. So industry sources, NGO sources, publicly available information that may connect the smelter to the covered countries. And here's how this works. This is in the SEC final rule. Effectively, if we have that reason to believe they may be sourcing from the covered countries, then they're going to move to the left-hand side of the flowchart. And the standard of care is exactly the same as if that smelter had confirmed with us directly that they do source. So if we have that reason to believe they may be sourcing and they're not RMAP conformant, that's a high-risk smelter, and that has to be addressed. The opposite is also true, though. If we don't have a reason to believe they may be sourcing, then they move to the right-hand side of this flowchart, and we can handle it that way. Okay, pass things back to Lucy.
Hey, thank you, Tim. So now that Tim's gone through our process for Dodd-Frank and how we identify high-risk smelters, I'm actually going to provide a couple of examples for high-risk smelters. And these are ones that if you've been working with Claigan, we've been flagging for a while now. So this part might not be new for you, but if anyone's newer to conflict minerals or they're seeing push from customers about reporting these smelters on their CMRT, then hopefully this can provide a bit of context, sort of what the risks are that are associated with them. So this first one we're talking about here, African Gold Refinery. This is a gold refinery located in Uganda, so it's actually in one of the covered countries. And I'm going to start us off actually going back in time a little bit. We're going to go back to the 1980s, 1990s, and the story really starts with a gold refinery located in Belgium called the Tony Getz Refinery. So this was opened up by a man named Tony Getz, and he had a son, Alain Getz, and there were many allegations that throughout the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, Tony and Alain were involved with illicit gold coming out of the DRC. So in 2015, South African Resource Watch alleged that Alain and his father purchased an estimated 100 tons of raw gold between 1987 and 2001 from illicit sources in the DRC. That Tony Getz refinery, it is still around. It's called Industrial Refining Company. So again, that's one you should also be looking out for on your CMRT. There's a whole story that goes along with that one, but to save us time, we'll stick with African Gold Refinery today. So in 2014, this is when Alain opens up African Gold Refinery in Uganda. And then for the years that follow, we see various allegations come out against this facility. For example, in 2018, the Century published their Golden Laundromat report, which connected African Gold Refinery to smuggled gold from the DRC up till as recently as 2017. In 2020, the UN group of experts on the DRC alleged that African Gold Refinery may have imported illicit material from the DRC as recently as 2019. At that point of the UN group of experts report, Alain Getz had claimed to no longer have any ownership of AGR. However, the group of experts in that report identified he still did have business ties through a complicated network of shell companies. Alongside the publishing of this report, in 2020, Alain and his brother were both found guilty by a Belgian court for a scheme that was set up back in 2010 that allowed the Belgian refinery to buy $1 billion worth of untraceable gold with cash. So we still have the UN group of experts calling these people out. we're getting convictions from courts in Europe, and everything sort of comes to a head in March of 2022 when the United States sanctioned Getz and African Gold Refinery because of the alleged connection to conflict gold. And this was followed in December of 2022 when the EU sanctioned Getz. So the EU did not extend the sanctions to the facility, but they did sanction Getz. And so while we're on this topic of sanctions, I want to dive into this topic a little because it's been coming up more and more in recent years. We saw it come up back in 2022 with the Russian issue when there was the sanctions placed on Russian gold, and that seemed to be a bit more of a gray area. You know, there's a blanket ban on Russian gold, but there wasn't maybe a specific facility on CMRTs that would be associated with that. Like that specific refiner, for example, isn't named on an OFAC sanctions list, where it's a little bit more clear cut. We have African Gold Refinery itself named on an OFAC sanction list. And so the pressure for AGR has maybe been a little bit more intense than what it was for the Russian gold issue, because it is just that much more clear cut. Okay. So we get customers asking us, okay, we're getting flags for the sanctioned entity. What do we do? And our answer is really the exact same thing you would do with any other high-risk refiner, okay? So again, we understand it is a bit of a gray area because you're not directly purchasing from these facilities, but nonetheless, if they're being reported on your CMRTs, we do have to conduct that proper due diligence process. And so the first thing that we want to do is identify, are there any sanctioned entities being reported on supplier CMRTs? And if so, which ones are reporting them? At this point, we always recommend that the first step be to verify whether that sanctioned facility is actually in the parts being supplied to your company. So a really easy way to do this is, if we're talking about African Gold Refinery, does the part you're purchasing from the relevant supplier even contain gold? And if it doesn't, then that's a really easy way to resolve the risk. And then from there, you can begin escalating with the relevant suppliers and requesting removal of that facility. And here, we're also talking about incorporating expectations into supplier agreements. If you're struggling with escalations, then maybe, you need to consider, what are you saying in your supplier contracts about sourcing from high-risk smelters or from sanctioned entities, and make sure you're really setting those expectations from the start. And finally here, our recommendation is be prepared to answer questions and report on all of the steps that you've taken from 1 to 3 here, not just in your Form SD, but when customers ask you what you're doing to approach African Gold Refinery in your supply chain or other outside sources. We've heard of companies getting inquiries to their grievance mechanisms, to their hotlines about reporting sanctioned entities on their Form SDs. Just be prepared to talk about it in a transparent way with those asking you questions. Okay, moving on, I'm going to talk about another high-risk facility. This is Augmont Enterprises. So this is a gold refiner located in India. And they first came up in a 2019 NGO report published by the NGO Impact, connecting executive level members of the company to smuggled gold from Uganda. Not so much a Dodd-Frank issue, but worth mentioning that in 2020, there was also allegations made connecting the facility to illicit gold dealers in Peru. Augmont Enterprises was actually on the active list from around the beginning of 2021 up until just this past January. This entire time, as Tim has mentioned, because of the connections to the covered countries, despite the active status, we were still flagging them as a high risk until they passed that audit. We considered to be the facility a high risk. And in the case of Augmont, we were providing, I think, a little bit more of a nudge to our clients that, this is one they definitely want to act on because the audit was just taking so long to progress. And what we found, clients were really struggling to push with their suppliers, and suppliers were essentially being willfully blind to the evidence because of the active status. But thankfully for our clients, when this facility did come off the active list this past January, they were ready and had already been engaging the supply chain about this issue. Okay, I want to switch gears for a second now and give a little update on the three T's. So historically, virtually all the high risks have really laid with gold when we're talking about the Dodd-Frank context. However, just because of the situation on the ground in the DRC over the last year or so, we are seeing the potential for this to change in the 2024 reporting year. So as I mentioned, violence has been escalating in eastern DRC over the last year or so, and this includes the presence of armed groups in and around mine sites. In the province of North Kivu, the M23 rebel group has taken control of roads in and out of the province's capital, Goma, which is a region rich in tin and tantalum mining. And so they essentially, in that way, can get control of trade routes for these minerals. Over the last year, the United Nations group of experts on the DRC has sent out warnings about the risks that the increased conflict is posing to 3T supply chains. The UN group of experts are actually set to release their new report probably sometime in the next week or so. So it'll be interesting to see what they have to say there. One of the consequences of this increased conflict is that it's made proper traceability in the region really difficult to do. On May 8th, 2024, the upstream mechanism ITSCI announced that the organization had to suspend its operations in North Kivu, DRC. If you're not familiar with ITSCI, they're an on-the-ground traceability scheme, and what they do is they provide legitimate mine sites with tags so that they can label minerals, and then smelters, by sourcing through the ITSCI system, can feel assured that they're getting supplies from a legitimate source. Unfortunately, it's just not safe for them to operate at this point in time, and this is actually the third time ITSCI's had to pull out of the region since March of 2023. While we're on the topic of ITSCI, I think it's important to mention that the program itself has come under some recent criticism. This really started back in 2022. The NGO Global Witness released a report identifying some potential loopholes with the scheme that might allow for conflict material to enter into the ITSCI supply chain. ITSCI did recently undergo a realignment assessment with the OECD, which they were found to be in alignment. However, the other issue that ITSCI is having is that their recognition with RMI has lapsed. And so what we're hoping it won't be an issue, but what could be an issue is this could affect conformance rates among 3T smelters, because in the past, they've been able to rely on their use of ITSCI in order to comply with the RMAP audits, and they're now going to have to produce some alternative or extra documentation in order to be in compliance. And so if they're unable to do so, we could see a decrease in 3T conformance rates and therefore an increase in 3T high risks. The unfortunate alternative to that is that smelters choose to cease sourcing from the region entirely. And we've received anecdotal accounts from smelters who have stated that their company's plan is to refrain from sourcing from the covered countries altogether until ITSCI can regain recognition. So this is an unfortunate consequence. The goal of Dodd-Frank and the work we're doing is never to boycott minerals from this region, just to make sure they're being sourced in a responsible way. Okay, shifting gears again, as Tim mentioned, lots to go through today. I want to provide a quick update on forced labor. So back in the fall of 2022, Tim presented a webinar identifying 6 high-risk gold refiners in connection to gold mining in Xinjiang. And I'm going to provide an example of another one today. We've been continuing this research over the last few years and have identified a few more facilities that we are flagging to our clients at this point. We've identified in total 7 gold high risks, 1 tungsten smelter, and 1 cobalt facility in connection to the Xinjiang region. I also want to point out that we're also looking into smelters and refiners with looser connections to Xinjiang. So one example might be it's a tantalum smelter, and it's part of a larger parent company that has a nickel mine in the Xinjiang province. So there's no concern of that material actually entering that smelter supply chain, but just want to note that they are part of a company that may have some affiliations in the region, something that some of our clients do want to be privy to. And so we're making a point to capture all those details as well. And finally here, we do want to note that we expect to see this list grow as we continue our research into battery minerals, looking at nickel, lithium, natural graphite. All of these minerals are found in the Xinjiang province. And so we do anticipate that there will be more high risks here as well. Okay, so the example I'm going to provide you with today is Zhonghuan Gold Smelter of Zhongzhen Gold Corporation. So this is a gold refiner that's likely found on a lot of companies' CMRTs. And this was a recent find for us that we've been flagging for our clients. So you'll see on the top left-hand picture here, a list of smelters owned by Zhongzhen Gold Corporation. And that one at the top, that Henan Zhonghuan Gold Smelter, is this facility. You'll then notice in the bottom right-hand photo, on the next page on this website is a list of mines owned by Zhongzhen Corporation, and you can see that one number 26, China National Gold Group, Xinjiang Jintan Mining. This is a gold mine located in Xinjiang. So very similar to the other refiners that we've identified, we're finding that the smelter is part of a larger parent company that has gold operations in the Xinjiang province. And so one of the things I want to note here, okay, we don't know for a fact that the gold being mined in Xinjiang is 100% being refined at the Henan refinery here, but we also don't know for a fact that the gold being mined in Xinjiang is not being refined at the Henan refinery that is found on your CMRTs. And so the way UFLPA is structured is sort of more innocent or guilty until proven innocent. And so unless we have that confirmation that the facility is absolutely not sourcing from XUAR, we want to be flagging that as a high risk for your clients, because it is certainly a potential risk in the supply chain. I also want to make a comment here that similar to other Xinjiang high risk gold refiners, this facility has gone through industry recognized audits. That said, you will still see customers pushing about them. So while those audits are a very important tool, they alone are not sufficient evidence for UFLPA. And so, these audits are made for a very specific purpose, and that's about sourcing from CARAs and having the proper systems in place, and that information is extremely valuable to us. But you may still find customers are pushing back because the UFLPA law is just so strict.
Okay, thank you, Lucy. So now again, we're going to pivot one more time. I'm going to talk to you about the PRT, the Pilot Reporting Template. Now, what this is you've seen the CMRT has a very defined scope: tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold. The EMRT, an equally, even more narrowly defined scope of just cobalt and mica. Well, then there's the PRT. And the PRT comes along and it says, look, we're going to be able to trace any kind of mineral you want. So it's going to be a very powerful tool. It could you could capture your supply chain for any mineral under the sun effectively. So while there's that great side to its open nature, there's also a danger in that if you cast that net too wide, you may end up with an unfocused and an ineffective program. So what we recommend is don't start there. Don't start with casting a wide net. Limit your scope. And our recommendation, where we're typically talking with our clients about, it's really focusing on 6 minerals right now, which is already a lot. I mean, that's already a good number. Many of them are interested in nickel, lithium, and natural graphite, and that's because of EU battery. Other ones that are quite common that we're hearing about, though, are copper, aluminum, and silicon. And so we've selected these minerals not only because there's a greater interest from our clientele, these are the ones that we hear they're talking about, but also because we feel there's going to be a greater chance of success. And so we want to keep it limited to at most these right now. It's not to say we can't do more, but really our recommendation is to just try to have that narrowly focused scope. And the other thing too is, keep in mind, your suppliers are not going to have this information in their back pockets the first time you ask them. If you come out and ask them for their processors of nickel, lithium, natural graphite, copper, aluminum, silicon, you ask for that information, you're not going to get they're not going to have all that information just on hand. It's going to take them time to work on it. And that's why it's so important. And this is our other major recommendation here: start early. Start now, prepare your supply chain. You may not ultimately really need this until 2025, but if you wait until June of 2025, you are not going to have the information you need on time. You need to prepare them. You need to make your expectations clear to your supply chain. And so engage with them now, set those expectations early, say it's going to take time. So you need to give them that time if you want quality responses from them, or responses at all, because I'm sure some of you have seen sometimes if the ask is too great, suppliers will do their best to kind of bury their head and maybe not try to respond right away to see how serious you are. So just set those expectations early. And really, again, it's start small, start with this limited, a more narrow scope, get some initial success with this program, get some early successes, and then build out from there in subsequent years. You're much better. You're going to have a much more effective program, efficient program, if you start early and start narrow and build out from there in subsequent years.
Okay, thanks, Tim. So as Tim's going off on this topic about sort of the expanding scope and looking at the PRT, I mean, something that always comes to mind for me when I'm thinking PRT is the EU battery regulation. That's certainly been a major driver for us. And with the EU battery regulation, what we get is a much more broad scope of risk. So not just looking at conflict affected areas, but looking at human rights and environmental risks as well. And so as we've been building out that program, we sort of went back to looking at our 3TG facilities and thought, well, why aren't we applying this sort of same broader ESG approach to 3TGs as well? And so what we've been looking to do is kind of analyze different geographies, particularly major producing areas, and try and come up with some sort of risk categorizations for these areas. So looking at these different environmental and human rights risks, and seeing where in the supply chain for tin, tantalum, and tungsten gold we're finding these risks. So the example I'm going to provide today is Amazon region gold. So over the last few years, we've seen increased concern with gold coming out of Amazon countries like Brazil, Peru, Venezuela, and Colombia, because of a major issue with illegal mining in this region. And so one thing I want to point out here is, we're not talking about Brazilian gold or Colombian gold, but we're really taking a broader regional approach. The Amazon rainforest doesn't have borders, and the criminal organizations operating here don't have borders. So it really makes more sense to look at this on a much broader regional scale. I also want to point out that Latin American gold is extremely prevalent in supply chains. We looked back at Claigan's 2023 RCOI data and found that Latin American countries were the third most frequently reported origin for gold, behind only recycled material and China. So this was mostly coming from, again, the Amazon region, Brazil, Colombia, and Peru. That suggests that 16% of gold refiners wholly or partially sourced from Latin America. If we exclude recyclers, then that's 22% of gold refiners are wholly or partially sourcing from Latin America. So very, very prevalent in the supply chain. I do want to highlight on the bottom right corner here, I've included a report from Insight Crime. It goes into the different environmental crimes as a result of illegal mining in the Amazon region, and I would highly encourage anyone looking to learn more about the topic to give this a read. Okay, moving forward, I want to dive into some examples of the evidence that we have looked at to sort of assess risk in the Amazon region. And there's lots of information on these slides. There's links, as Tim mentioned. We're going to be sending this out hopefully tomorrow morning. And so I highly encourage everyone to follow these links and get into the details and really see the kind of work that Claigan is doing on a day-to-day basis. We don't want our process to be a secret to anyone. This is stuff that you can look at for yourself. So I want to touch on here a few points that I just found particularly insightful. This point at the top here about forced labor. For myself, forced labor isn't exactly what first comes to mind when I'm thinking about illegal mining in the Amazon region. But we found this report just from this past May by the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, which they're currently conducting a project in the Brazil Pará state looking into potential forced labor in the Brazilian gold mining sector. And the UN Office of Drugs and Crime found that it's possible that up to 40% of workers at illegal mines in Brazil may classify as victims of forced labor. So their research was consisted of interviews with individuals working in the illegal mining sector. They found that 40% of respondents said that the role they were doing was very different than what had been advertised to them by the employer. And 44% stated that they were being charged inflated prices for goods and services from their employer. And both of these are key indicators of forced labor. You'll see here we're looking also at more occupational health and safety issues here. We have a link to an example of a gold mine collapse at a small scale mine in Peru. And at the same time, we are still tracking those issues of conflict when we're looking at CARAs, such as Colombia, where it is known that criminal organizations do benefit from exploiting gold resources. The last example I'll cover here, and this is getting more into the indigenous rights issues that come with Amazon, illegal gold mining in the Amazon, but it also really demonstrates the way that all of these risk categories work together. And so why we're kind of choosing to take a regional approach and then break it down from there instead of looking at each risk category independently, because they often play off one another. So one of the indigenous groups in the Amazon that has been very vocal about the problems they've been facing is the Yanomami in Brazil. Just this past January, they contributed, or 3 organizations representing this indigenous group contributed to a joint letter calling for the Brazilian government to take stronger action against illegal mining. And they cited various risks to the health and safety of their community that have been escalating over the past few years. Some things you might not even think about. These are sort of remote, traditional communities. They have very compromised immune systems, and so when there's this massive influx of illegal miners, they bring with them respiratory diseases that can weaken the community so that they're not able to perform their subsistence tasks, but also increases the number of deaths. Another thing that surely didn't come to my mind at first, but I've seen more and more reports of, is that these illegal miners are usually armed. And so they're bringing in weapons, guns into these indigenous communities, and they're leveraging existing conflicts between villages. And so not only are the illegal miners engaging in conflict, but the indigenous peoples now have guns that they're using in their conflict amongst each other. And I also have to bring up here the obvious very detrimental environmental impacts of illegal mining, such as deforestation and the mercury contamination that has been impacting the ecosystems that these indigenous groups heavily rely on. Okay.
Okay, thanks very much. So as you can see, there's really a lot to go through. The conflict mineral space has become a lot more complicated over the past few years. There are more regulations, more supply chain pressure. There's more minerals, more risk categories. Companies are being pushed to ask to know more, and more. And so it's really become complex. Companies often come to us asking how best to handle these complexities. As I've already stated, I think number one, you want to start early. You can't start too early. Really, the earlier you start, the more ahead of the game you can be. And when in doubt, work with subject matter experts who can inform you about the issues so that you're prepared to handle them. You already know these issues ahead of time. You already have a solution in place if something sort of escalates. And also, if your higher ups want to know if you're on top of things, you can give them confident answers because you're working with experts that are providing you not only the risks and the identification of these risks, but the data that backs them up behind them so that you can look into it yourself and you can point to something and say, yes, this is why this is a risk. So here are email addresses. You can reach out to us and we'd love to talk. So thanks so much for attending the webinar. Hope you all have a great day.